Okay, so as everyone can see, I'm going to pass around this copy of the syllabus, and this is your chance to sign up for a presentation. And it's your call where you want to sign up. If I don't recommend two people sign up for the same text, but if there's something you really wanted and someone's already signed up for it, well, I guess we can talk. But I'll probably dissuade. So I'd rather just one person per text, but if that happens, we'll get to it. So again, just take a look at it and feel free to pick what you want, what you like. I will mention though that actually on, I believe it's October 2nd, I have to have a class on Zoom. So we'll have class on regular time, but we'll just be meeting on Zoom. That's on the 2nd, so I don't know, that doesn't really mean that much, but psychoanalysis day. Other days though, of course, unless we're sick, we'll just be here. And hopefully there's something of interest that you want, that you have maybe a preference for in terms of signing up, and we'll be excited to see what people choose. So I'm just going to send it around. Yes, Kelly?
When are your presentations? Are they like on the same day as the topic?
Yeah. So in fact, I will have the presenter begin that text.
Okay.
Not necessarily. I mean, if it's like the second or third reading, then we'll do the first reading first. But then, they'll be the first one, so that I don't say things that you've already done, so that you give full freedom to begin the conversation, and then we'll go over a few more points.
Yeah, it's one text, not like the whole.
Yeah, just one text. Just one text.
Oh, I'm so sorry. We have to go live.
Okay.
We're doing a lot. Yeah.
You choose. I'm not going to say. You pick whatever you want. As we go on.
What are you
Maybe a shot in the dark.
So if it's only one text, I guess
Any
we're
other
not going to get
questions,
stuck
or-
totally
okay.
last, right? Like there's more text than people at
Well,
least.
you're going to do it quietly, though.
Okay, that's good.
Because we have more to talk about.
Oh, so it's like one
any
a day
questions?
then? Oh wait, can I?
No. This is being passed around, so yeah. So just pick it up when it gets to you.
So is it one person per day and then one text per person per day? Or no?
And it can be several people in a particular day,
okay,
but just
okay.
one person per text.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
cool. Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, so we have some options.
Yeah. But I'm sorry for the groups on this side if it gets to you and you feel like. But yeah, like I said, if that's something you really want, then let's talk. We'll talk and see what has been chosen.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so anyways, that Nietzsche was probably a giant headache. We'll just sort of store it in the back of our head and see what we can do with it later. Now we turn to Northrop Frye. So I also thought today, as first day, we would kind of see sort of a very early text, a middle, let's say, range text, and then a contemporary text with Laurent Berlant. Here we are with Northrop Frye. This is from 1951, and sort of early in his career, but he's sketching out his whole sort of method and project. He is, of course, a Canadian icon of literary theory. I suppose really the first Canadian literary theorist, and still a fascinating character. So it's lovely that we can give him his Canadian due. But he's also really interesting because he's the same existential crisis as all of us, and he's in a situation in which, something we'll talk a little bit more about next week, but where there's sort of another massive reorganization of the university system, and humanities are sort of, again, becoming popular or drawing a lot of attention, and the question is what do you do there? What do you do in the English department? And so he's trying to sketch out a method. And he is of the same generation as what we call new criticism, material that we'll look at next week. He's slightly different, though, in his methods than most new criticism. And so that's a little bit of the setup. But he's going to try and answer the question, what do we all do, and how do we do it? And in the English department. And one last thing is that there's a set of lectures he gave called the Massey Lectures, and they were recorded on CBC. And sometimes, like Ideas likes to replay them from time to time or something like that. So if you really want to listen to him ponder away and give speeches, you can listen to those Massey Lectures. And in those lectures, he says something that I totally agree with. He says from the get-go, he says, the basic questions are the most important and the hardest to answer. And here are some of his basic questions. What is literature? How should we read? what should we read? What is good literary criticism? And what is the relation of literature and to social and historical situations, including the present? So, questions we're all familiar with, powerful questions, and hard questions at the same time, of course. So let's see how he takes on these very questions in our reading together. This time I'll have more questions for you because it's, I think, fun to talk about good old Northrop Frye. Okay, so someone want to volunteer to read that first paragraph on 1250. Great, Vincent.
Sure. Every organized body of knowledge can be learned progressively, and experience shows that there is also something progressive about the learning of literature. Our opening sentence has already got us into some semantic difficulty. Physics is an organized body of knowledge about nature, and a student of it says that he is learning physics, not that he's learning nature. Art, like nature, is the subject of a systematic study, and has to be distinguished from the study itself, which is criticism. It is therefore impossible to learn literature. One learns about it in a certain way, but what one learns transitively is the criticism of literature. Similarly, the difficulty often felt in teaching literature arises from the fact that it cannot be done. The criticism of literature is all that can be directly taught. So while no one expects literature itself to behave like a science, there is surely no reason why criticism, as a systematic and organized study, should not be at least partly a science. Not a pure or exact science, perhaps, but these phrases form part of a 19th century cosmology, which is no longer with us. Criticism deals with the arts and may well be something of an art itself, but it does not follow that it must be unsystematic. If it is to be related to the sciences too, it does not follow that it must be deprived of the graces of culture.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, I'm going to start us off with the question, which is, according to Northrop Frye, is criticism a science? And as you're wondering how you want to answer that question, I might ask, why do you think he is worried about whether or not criticism is a science? So do you think he thinks that literary criticism is a science? And again, why do you think it's important even as a question for him or for you? What do you think? How do you want to respond? Go ahead, Julia, if you want.
Half-baked thought, but is it like to validate literature as like a study of the university?
Exactly, yeah. So as I already hinted, that's a thing that people want to sort of do or justify, especially right around, let's say, this moment in the 1950s. And although I don't think that question's gone away. Like, okay, do you think literary theory or literary criticism or literature is a science right now? Not really. No, I don't think literary theory is a science. But I don't think I want to just throw away that concept of science exactly. So, Nick.
Can I just ask you why you don't think it's a science?
Yeah, you can always ask, yeah. Because it doesn't have the same, let's say, rules of verification. So this is a famous claim about science. Science is verifiable by anyone in any situation. It's reproducibly verifiable. So when someone does a chemistry experiment, a second person who's totally unrelated can do that experiment. When someone does a literary reading, can a second person reproduce it? If they did, we'd actually say that's a bad reading. That's tiresome. That's tedious. So there's already some mismatch there with what we would expect from science versus what we expect from like literary theory. Second is that we actually think that the better version of a literary theory has something new to say, original to say. Science is much more like, can you repeat the same evidence? It doesn't require discovery and invention, for sure, but it wants that repeatability factor. So already I think we're on very different grounds. Well, what do you think Northrop Frye is saying, though? Because he's not saying what I'm saying. All right, Sarah, Kelly, and Ms. Kelly?
Okay, well, kind of relating back to Nietzsche, or Nietzsche, how
Nietzsche,
I mentioned
yeah.
if science is kind of a way of like decoding the world or trying to understand the truth of it, and then Nietzsche says we can never get to the truth of the world, then criticism is also throwing around different theories about how to understand the world. But at the same time, science can be made up. Like 100 years from now, maybe like someone will say Darwin was all wrong,
Okay.
and then we will have an existential crisis again.
Yeah. Nicely said.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if maybe we think that the world is requires interpretation, or we don't have access to an absolute truth, only a partial truth, and if that's the case, then literature and science are actually in the same boat. Nietzsche said that. So he's not said that literature is better than science or science is better than literature. He's deconstructed, as we say, that kind of opposition, and said that they actually were kind of in the same situation, and even he is not against learning from science, but he wants, let's say, literary theory or language or philosophy to have its own understanding of what it really is doing. And if that's, and if you say it in that way, science wants that same understanding too. I actually think we're getting close to what Fry is saying. Fry's going to, in this very paragraph that we read, he's kind of implying a similar thing, but let's keep going a little bit. Okay, so Dakota and Vince, sorry, Sarah first, and then Dakota.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that I think as you read it, like his argument is that literature, is that criticism should be a science because you should be able to interpret something correctly if
Yeah.
you do it enough.
Yeah. So Northrop Frye is leaning towards saying, I want to associate myself with science, the sciences, because there's a kind of correctness of interpretation, and it may not be perfect. He does say that as well. There's no perfect interpretation, but science doesn't need even perfect answers either. Science can be okay with sort of pretty correct or pretty close or pretty accurate measurements and answers. Even in the response to Kelly, thinking science actually changes its theories too. So he's saying that literature should, or literary criticism or theory, whatever you want to call it, it says it is as an organized study, it should not be. It should be at least partly a science for its sense of consistency. Yeah. There's a word that applies here. It would have applied even for their Nietzsche stuff, but it is very applicable here and will be for the rest of our lives. It is, like we would just say, like relativism or subjectivism. We sort of use that as well. And the problem is that Fry is wondering, he's like, are we all making it up? Is that what English majors do? Do we just walk in a room and make up readings and theories? Are we totally subjective, totally personal? And if we believe that, then are we lost? But also we know in the 1950s context, that's poorly valued. Subjective reasoning, mere opinion, relativistic thinking is poorly valued in a world in which it's sort of explosion of science, and science is really delivering everything from nuclear bombs to computers and so on, and space shuttles. So if literature is just delivering, whatever you think it is, then he does not believe that's a particularly promising position to be in. It's up to you, though. Do you think it might be? We'll get to that as we go through this, but his reaction is to say that this is, instead, let's associate ourselves with science. So there was a few more hands. Do you want to, Dakota and then Vincent?
Yeah, I was just going to touch on the importance in science of rigorous methodology, which is kind of what we're getting at in terms of its replicability.
Yeah.
The fact that you can do a study, you have the methodology of how to do it, and it's there specifically so you can come back and do the same thing. And that's something that literary studies tend not to prioritize, the idea that this is the exact way in which I've approached this so that you can do the same thing.
But I love that point. That's awesome. And yet, at the same time, whenever I write something, whenever you write something, you do want someone to agree with you. You don't want just someone to say, that's your thing, cool. I don't get it, or it's not hitting me, so because I do my thing. Like whenever we write, on the one hand, we don't want to repeat what other people said. On the other hand, we want people to recognize what we said as fair, reasonable, helpful. So that a little bit of a sense of repeatability. We want them to repeat it to themselves and say, oh yeah, that makes sense, that's good reading, I understand this better. So we do want a little bit of that famous repeatability quality in literary theory, but not to the extent that it's the same chemistry experiment over and over again. Okay, what do you think, Vincent?
Yeah, I was thinking something kind of similar, and also where he compares it to, he says, like, criticism could be an art in itself, or
Okay.
could be compared to it. Art usually
Yeah.
has like a lot of things similar to science that are repeatable, or methods that are repeated by different people.
Okay.
So I think that's why he might call it like a half science. So, you know, like
Yeah.
back in the old day, like a lot of artists were also scientists. Like,
Okay, yeah.
They also studied like a lot of biology and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
Things that can be like replicated again in like nature or
Yeah.
in science, but also that can be implemented within art.
Yeah.
So I think that's how he's trying to relate like criticism as an art form to the sciences.
Yeah.
As a art
Yeah,
history.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, we can recognize that artists can use some scientific methods of inquiry or science itself, or be aware of science and make art out of that. So there's no real divide between art and science deep down. On the other hand, we also still recognize, though, that art is famously, like let's say, disinterested or not doesn't have a utility factor. So there are complete opposite arguments too, and that art also is sort of like creative, like romantic genius comes out of just my inspirational imagination or something like that. So that's the total opposite. So whereas I like your argument, and I think Northrop Frye would also be drawn to that. On the other hand, it's still lingering in his head. What do I do with those people who think that art itself is either made up or literary theory is made up?
I think the other thing that I was just thinking of is that it seems like Frye sort of thinks that literary criticism like inevitably will become a science. It's not necessarily that he's like, we need to make it into a science. It's that he thinks that it's following the path of other forms of science. Like he has that paragraph on 1253 where he talks about like other, like physics and social sciences and how they had this like underdeveloped stage where they were very interpretive and like sort of loose, and then they became more rigid as it went on. And he seems to think that this is just the natural.
It should be the trend.
Yeah,
exactly. And that the better we get at literary theory, the more rigorous, consistent, repeatable, let's say correct, we'll get. Do you believe that? Is that true for you as a theorist? Do you think we're getting to more and more correct, let's say, comprehensive, and maybe that's another word for that, progress? He believes in the progress narrative of literature. He says that word a couple times, especially at the end of the sentence. That there's a progress narrative in literary theory and literary study that will get closer and closer to that, as Matthew Arnold said, to the object. I want to quote him correctly. To see the object as it really is, and we'll get closer and closer to that achievement. Do you think that's true? Well, all right. Go ahead. Last.
Well, I think it's funny, and he really speaks to the time that he's writing, because he talks about physics as like this, just after Einstein, like this idea that's like, oh, we figured out physics, and then decades later, it's like, oh, Einstein wasn't actually entirely right, and there's something else to it. Yeah. And so we see like the touchstone he uses as like the sciences are themselves unraveling.
Yeah. Yeah. And exactly. Well, he's aware. Yeah, he's aware that science is kind of perpetually in crisis too. So we stand in an interesting, let's say, epistemological position in the humanities and the English department of saying, well, we recognize that, but it's a crisis for you in a different way than it is a crisis for us. Because for you, maybe there's what is science anymore? For us, it's like actually we can build on that crisis and do literary thinking and so on. But that's a little get ahead. And by the way, you've all read this essay, so you know where it's going to go. You'll be surprised to find out what he is going to demonstrate as scientific, let's say, comprehensive knowledge about literature will be in just a second. But before we get to his answer about how to do what he says, how criticism might be like a science, nice use of the simile there, he adds the word systematic study. That's kind of synonymous for him in this opening paragraph. So the systematic study of art is no different than the systematic study of anything else in nature. And that systematic study of art is criticism. The systematic study of literature is literary criticism. And there should be a systematic study, or another word for that would be called method. There should be a systematic method. And so we will need to establish what that is. And he's going to give us his argument for that in just a minute. And so that's how literary criticism approaches itself to science. So the more systematic it can be. But again, do we still feel that way? Do I feel like myself as a systematizer? I don't really think of it like that. But I want to point out, though, I'll go a little quickly here on the next page on 1251, that he is going to point out a few things that he doesn't think are that helpful in terms of the history of criticism or other examples. I'm just going to jump around here, but anyways, he says, all right, certainly criticism as we find it in learned journals and scholarly monograph has every characteristic of a science. Okay, evidence is examined scientifically, previous authorities are used scientifically, fields are investigated scientifically, texts are edited scientifically. So, okay, already he's giving us reason to think that there's already a sense of the scientific and the literary critical. Prosody is scientific in structure, but I don't really care that much, you know. And Nietzsche, by the way, just said kind of the opposite, but anyways. So is philology, and yet in studying this kind of critical science, the student becomes aware of a centrifugal movement carrying him away from literature. Mm-hmm. He finds that literature is the central division of the humanities, okay? But when you do that, you'll find that flanked on one side is history and the other is philosophy, and then criticism is sort of like somewhere in the distance there, ranked only as a subdivision of literature, and so on. And he says, for the systematic mental organization of the subject, the student has to turn to the conceptual framework of the historian for events and to that of the philosopher for ideas. I guess I read that. I've marked a bunch of things I wanted to comment on, but I'm glad I read that out loud. I'll just quickly say, instead of asking a question, though, is that basically he says one of the problems is in literary study is that we actually privilege other fields above literary criticism. So let's say you study literature, but really you want to talk about history. Okay, very common. Sometimes we call that historicism. So if that's the case, then why are you exactly calling yourself a literary critic? And second, you kind of put it significantly lower in value, in epistemological value, let's say, in just relevance in the university and in your own department. Is that a good way of doing it? Shouldn't you have literature as literary criticism as your thing and not defer to history for events, he says, and also defer to philosophy for ideas? So he wants to avoid that. Then he goes on to say that like textual studies, textual editing, he says, is like a background it's more like history or some other non-literary field. So the person who's creating edited volumes and sort of like let's say official versions of a play or something like that sometimes says very little about the actual play, but more about like, is this printing the right printing or something like that. So maybe we're talking about print history rather than literature. But on the other hand, as some readings in the future, specifically Peter Stallerbrass will try and poke holes in that. Say print history is literary theory, but that's later. But anyways, you can see all other reasons why we might like actually take, we would say decenter literature and actually privilege other kinds of fields. History, philosophy, print, maybe anthropology, psychology, other things like that. And he's not so thrilled by that idea. Then another thing that he's not so thrilled about is in the next paragraph. I'll just go even faster. He says, most of the central area of criticism is at present and doubtless always will be the area of commentary. But the problem with commentary, and I won't spend too much time on this, is like it doesn't have a system. It just is like a one-off thing. Whether it's like a review or just even someone writing a full book. Let's say they're writing a full book on Milton, or they're writing a full book on Jane Austen, or they're writing a full book on Margaret Atwood. But, okay, is it just one-off study of the author? Or does it actually speak to a method in the English department that is, let's say, reproducible or progressive or leads to a better understanding of what we do as a group? Most of the case, that is not the case. Most of the time, even myself, and maybe you feel this way too, you're just sort of writing a one-off essay. You're not taking on that task of systematizing what you're doing. And he's like, well, most of that will be what criticism is, but it's got a big problem, which is it doesn't really have a bigger thing to tell us. Then he has another paragraph we call it the pseudo proposition, that is sort of logical, but not really. It's between the subjective emotional and the objective descriptive. And he goes on at the bottom of 1251, very last sentence, says, our first step, therefore, is to recognize and get rid of meaningless criticism. That is, talking about literature in a way that cannot help to build up a systematic structure of knowledge. Casual value judgments belong not to criticism, but to the history of taste, and reflect at best only the social and psychological compulsions which prompted their utterance. All judgments in which the values are not based on literary experience, but are sentimental or derived from religious or political prejudice may be regarded as casual. Just pause there and ask you, what does he mean exactly? What's he complaining about? What's his problem with this thing called casual?
Anything that, like, his problem is basically that people are coming at it just to say whether or not it's good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like that's based on a number of things that are kind of going historically and culturally.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
whether that's like,
It's not a theory.
yeah, it's not a theory.
Yeah.
It's just like this is how you feel about the text,
Yeah.
and you're
Yeah.
telling me that, which is not useful.
Yeah, but as you wisely said, it actually is informed about a theory that that person probably is not really all that, like, has fully understood why they're making those judgments. So when we say I like it or I don't, or this is good or this is bad, the value judgments, casual value judgments, he calls them, well, they don't, he says, they have any value at the level of criticism. They only are really valuable as taste, expressions of taste. And they, in part because they'll never get beyond the casual part. And they'll never get on the sort of subjective taste, my opinion part. So he's taking on that question that we will receive repeatedly in this class of, like, are you just making it up? Is it just your opinion? Is it just something that you like or you think is interesting or something like that? Is there anything more than that? Some form of sentimental, or not just by the way that you like, but also you think is good because it's politically interesting. This is political prejudice or religious prejudice that you believe in a form of Christianity that is going to help you interpret everything around you. He says, okay, well, if that's where your knowledge and your sort of stability and your system comes from, fine, but that's really at the level of taste and not so much at the level of thinking what literature is and how it works. And so all of that kind of ends up in the same spot. Notably, of course, political prejudice is as problematic as anything else, and a lot of us think that there should be some political meaning to what we're doing. Minority, he's not so sure about that. Okay, anyways, he calls all this, at the end of this paragraph, leisure class conversation. This idea that that's really for luxury and leisureness, chit-chat, party talk. And this is another famous, crisis for what we do. Like, what's the difference between what we do and, reading, like the book club or the hanging out at the bar or talking with people in other contexts about literature. Because I don't devalue that, by the way. That's important to me too. But is that the same thing as what I do in the classroom? And I can make the case that it's different. And Northrop probably thinks it's very different. Okay, let's see what he thinks we should be doing. Let's skip forward to how we're going to come up with a system. Okay, just give me to 1254. I want to take a look at, I guess, hopefully this will be helpful. 2 paragraphs here. If someone wants to read for us. The paragraph that says, there is still the problem before us. There's still before us the problem of the formal cause of the poem. Thanks. Grace.
Oh, just the one paragraph?
That one and the next one, actually, would be good.
There's still before us the problem of the formal cause of the poem. The problem deeply involved with the question of genres. We cannot say much about genres, for criticism does not know much about them. A good many critical efforts to grapple with such words as novel or epic are chiefly interesting as examples of the psychology of rumors. 2 conceptions of genre, however, are obviously fallacious, and as they are opposite extremes, and truth must lie somewhere between them. One is the pseudo-Platonic conception of genres as existing prior to and independently of creation, which confuses them with mere conventions of form, like the sonnet. The other is that pseudo-biological conception of them as evolving species, which turns up in so many surveys of the development of this or that form. We next inquire for the origin of genre and turn first of all to the social conditions and cultural demands which produce it. In other words, to the material cause of the work of art. This leads us into literary history, which differs from ordinary history in that its containing categories, Gothic, Baroque, Romantic, and the like, are cultural categories, of little use to the ordinary historian. Most literary history does not get as far as these categories, but even so, we know more about it than about most kinds of critical scholarship. The historian treats literature and philosophy historically. The philosopher treats history and literature philosophically, and the so-called history of ideas approach marks the beginning of an attempt to treat history and philosophy from the point of view of an autonomous criticism.
Okay. I feel like I probably threw us into this material just without setting it up, but that's okay. I'll just suggest that, okay, he's got the same problem as we just talked about, is let's say you believe in a system of literary criticism, where does that come from? And basically he's just going to try and rely on some, we might call it inferential thinking. He's going to sort of build up from a starting point that seems to make sense, and that would be, you can see patterns recurring in literature. Okay? So we're not starting with philosophy, we're not starting with history, we're starting with literature. There are patterns in literature that repeat over and over again. And some basic patterns are the genres. Okay? And even at the very basic, we mean like novels, poems, epics. Okay? Those are the three, let's say, classical genres. So literary theory, if it will be a system, probably should tell us what those things are. Why are there patterns in literature? And why are there patterns, which we call genres, that fit this thing called a novel, an epic, and so on? And we were all familiar already with genres in our own readings and discussions. And where does he think genres come from already? Let's say he's trying to explain that now and systematize it. Does he think we're already, as long as we pointed out the genres, we're already in good shape? Where do we stand now that we've pointed out there are repeating patterns? Those patterns we call genres. Very basically, those patterns we might call now novel, poem, and epic. Have we given ourselves a good foundation for what we think a genre is? It's maybe a bit more advanced question as you're pondering your Northrop. But anyways, before I don't want because we still have one more reading. I'm not going to actually delay it too long. I'll just say a few more thoughts there. He just wants to make sure that we are not defining genres incorrectly, at least from the get-go. So these are not things that Plato told us were, let's say, perfect forms. These are also not things that, let's say, Darwin said are biologically motivated. So already those would be, we're not talking about philosophy and we're not talking biology. Where do genres come from? He's not sure. He says in the next sentence that we didn't get to, he says, we still feel like there's something missing. He's not exactly sure where genres come from. He'll tell you in just a second. But he thinks that most of the time, if we defer to those other sources, we're going to be, they're not the best. Can we find another source of genre and pattern? Yes, we can. As he's going to tell us in the very next paragraph and a few more. He says the following. That he says, okay, we say that every poet has, on 1254 at the bottom, his own peculiar formation of images, but when so many poets use so many of the same images, surely there's a much bigger critical problem involved than biographical ones. So Auden's brilliant essay, The Enchafed Flood, shows an important symbol like the sea cannot remain within the poetry of Shelley, Keats, or Coleridge. Okay, so simply put, Auden uses references to floods and seas, so does Shelley, so does Keats, so does Coleridge. Given that everyone likes to do that over and over again, what might we call that? He says in that sentence, it is bound to expand over many poets into an archetypal symbol of literature. Okay, so suddenly we see patterns. Now we're understanding where they come from. The fact that they just repeat on their own, that's already interesting, and we can systematically study them. Let's call them archetypes. Okay, what patterns repeat over and over again? Genres repeat, but also images repeat. And what kind of images repeat? Well, he's given us one, seas, let's say floods and waters. And so on. And he goes on, okay, in the rest of this paragraph, just the last sentence, the very bottom of 1254, it says, this is a problem of structure rather than origin, and suggests that there may be archetypes of genres as well as images. It's clear that criticism cannot be systematic unless there is a quality in literature which enables it to be so. An order of words corresponding to the order of nature in the natural sciences. An archetype should be not only a unifying category of criticism, but itself a part of a total form. Skipping slightly further, he says, if so, the search for archetypes is a kind of literary anthropology concerned with the way that literature is informed by pre-literary categories such as ritual, myth, and folktale. Already he's sort of giving us a kind of complex view of what he thinks an archetype is. That was my very question. What is an archetype according to Fry? So let's pause on there, and then finally I'll get to his examples. What does he mean by archetype exactly? And as you're thinking about it, I want you to consider that people loved this stuff. People loved this stuff. People who taught at Western was a huge place for Fry-style criticism. And what they would do is they would spend all their time looking for archetypes in the literature. So you would have class on the flood. You would have a class on, as you know, as you've seen later on, one of his favorite archetypes is the hero quest, the quest narrative. That's what you would do all day. You would look for that and talk about it and understand it. So I was asking you originally what an archetype is. But also, the weird question is that what we do? Is that what you look for in your literature, in your reading? But do we all understand what an archetype is so far? Anyone want to throw out a definition?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a recurring image or idea that like recurs so much that he considers it to be practically like universal or like united.
Exactly, yeah. One of the places it recurs is not just in literature, but in ritual as well. So if it recurs in ritual, so there are plenty of flood myths in, ancient religious beliefs and texts. So it recurs in those. It recurs in many religions and so on. It recurs in many communities. It recurs in many myths and folktales and so on. And if it recurs in those as well as it recurs in literature, we would call all that an archetype. So that sounds pretty good. We found a solid, first class. We just found a solid method that we might all share and agree is true in literature, and we're in really good shape. So I'm very happy, right, Nick?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment and say, I feel like up until this point, I would have referred to archetype as something like theme.
That too. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So very quickly, I think we're in good enough shape to quickly see his map of archetypes. So let's do that. And here I'm going to go much quicker. But after sketching a little bit more where some of these archetypes come from, and by the way, he loves his Jung and he loves his Fraser. So a little bit of psychology and anthropology. But anyways, by 1258, he's going to give us a nice map of his archetypal system. And he thinks that, I think he's fair enough to say that he's right, that like rituals are very seasonal, very temporal, and very repetitive. So in all religions and cultures and indigenous cultures, seasons matter and the calendar matters. So on 1258 he says, that's, dawn, spring, birth. So what form of archetypal myths or recurrent cultural patterns do we find in spring? We find the birth of the hero, revival and resurrection, creation, defeat of the powers of darkness in winter. We find the father and the mother because they're the birth figures. The archetype of romance, love, the consummation of love through the birth, and most dithyramic and rhapsodic poetry. Okay, fine. Second is now we're going seasonally. Okay, so we've decided our myths are largely structured by seasons, and those structure our genres and our characters and our texts and our archetypes. Zenith, the summer, and marriage or the triumphal phase. Myths of apotheosis, of the sacred marriage, entering into paradise. Shakespeare's on his brain. Midsummer Night's Dream. So we're midsummer, we're getting married, we're having fun in paradise and the pastoral and so on. Subordinate characters, the companion and the bride. Archetype of comedy. Midsummer Night's Dream is a comedy. Pastoral and idle. Okay, now we're in the fall. Sunset, autumn, death phase. Myths of the fall, dying god, violent death, sacrifice, and of the isolation of the hero. Subordinate characters, the traitor, and that siren, archetype of the tragedy and elegy. Okay, so now we know where comedy comes from, right? It comes from summer myths, summer rituals, and marriage and so on. And now we know where tragedy comes from. That's associated with ritualistic kind of seasonal of the fall. Of course, you can find like fall, or tragedy in the spring. It doesn't have to. He says it's not like this is not, math table or exactly, but this is a general schema of how literature works. Okay, tragedy nails you. Then finally, in winter, what do we see? Darkness, dissolution, myths of the triumphs of these powers, myths of floods, return of chaos, defeat of the hero, the god of Damarung myths, subordinate characters, the ogre and the witch, archetype of satire, and so on. Like Milton, Paradise Lost, or something like that. Lots of wintry imagery and language in there, and chaos. And then it repeats, and so on. And here is his wonderful map of what we're all going to do as archetypal literary systematizers. We are going to find all these things in literature, and we're going to describe them and think about them and so on. He gives you a tiny bit more, another second map on 1261, but it's sort of an expansion of this. So if you want the second map, you can see a little bit more examples of the tragic, more examples. Like the tragic is associated with wilderness, with ruin. Comedy is associated with human communion and togetherness and other things like that. Okay, so aren't we impressed? I mean, we've now gone from what the heck are we doing in this English department? We're not even a science to here's a systematic method that we can all apply, everyone in this room, and become Freudians. How does that sound to you? How does it? What's your thought, Julia?
Like immediately, it's super reductive. Like one of the first things you said was, "Oh, and obviously there's overlap." It's like, okay, well then what's the point of having? Like,
there's overlap between the seasons or whatever. Yeah.
Like, it seems like okay, like there's 4 things you could
look for. Yeah, effectively.
Like, you can just pick a number and then like try to categorize.
Yeah.
Them and just,
pick an archetype, find it in the text.
Yeah.
How inviting is that? Okay, and the archetypes are fairly limited. He'll give you other ones, but they're pretty. There's not a whole lot of them. Okay, Daniel.
Yeah, I'm really attracted to the idea. Like I kind of wish it was that.
Me too. Me too.
Like in the same way, I'm sort of I'm sort of attracted to the way like someone like Harold Bloom would just be like has this aesthetic scale of like Shakespeare's just the best, and then it's all these other guys. Yeah. But he's not. It's really not that simple either. Or at least that's what I think. So I mean, I kind of think like, I'm with Julia in that I wonder how useful it is. Like even today, in my TA lecture for Monica Lee, she drew the Northrop Frye circle on the board and did romance, satire, etc. She did the 4, and then she said, well, Sir Gawain is romance. Like it's the most obvious example. But then said, but it's actually kind of a comedy because it has a happy ending, and then puts it like in between them. And you kind of think, okay, so it's a way to think about stories. I think especially older stories. But then the other thing I find so weird about it, sorry I don't want to talk for too long, but is he's sort of developing this in the wake of modernism, like where in my opinion, or from what I can tell, like it kind of, for me that's the moment where a lot of these archetypes are kind of totally shattered.
And modernists don't believe it, so why is he believing it?
So it's just interesting to me that he's sort of like in this mid-century, and he's going to say, well, you can, like, what's the wasteland?
On the other side, though, Jung is a modernist, and he's reading Eliot, and he's reading Rilke, and so on, and he's pulling from literature. So there's a weird circle going on here, where it's like the modernists aren't so sure, but people are responding to it with modernism. A lot of people think that T.S. Eliot is full of archetypes. It was the thing to do in the 50s and 60s is to write that archetypal paper on the wasteland. So on. And I'm not throwing it out the window. But let's hear other thoughts from you. What do you think of this method?
To build upon what Daniel said, I feel like he's of the instability of literature and language.
Yeah.
And it's like a defense. It's like he's trying to categorize it. He's trying to make it systematic so it will be easier for him.
Yep, absolutely.
Which goes with
But I'm scared too. It's not. I identify with him because what do I do in a class? What do I do every day of my life?
But then the way he does it, like the way he answers to this, somehow undermines the powers of literature itself.
Why do you think that?
Because, I mean, it's looking at it as like something you can dissect and something that's easy.
Yeah. We might say he's overcompensating for that crisis by saying, here is a system that has already sort of been mapped out, and he's sort of articulating it, but it's like ritual already mapped it out for you. Myth already kind of told you what to look for. And it's sort of been there for thousands of years, and our job as contemporary literary theorists is just sort of remap it over and over again.
And that also somehow contradicts what he himself says about the text, because he's also going outside of literature. He's looking at these rituals. This
Very
is
nice.
kind of diachronic
Nicely caught. Yeah, he said we shouldn't defer to history, we shouldn't defer to philosophy. Well, what's he deferring to? Myth? No. Jung? That's psychology. So deep down, he thinks that underneath literature, the systematic study of literature is actually probably the systematic study of essentially myth and anthropology and psychology. It's not really literature, although you use the character or the figure or the genre to sort of launch that. But he's already poked a hole in his own theory. So nicely understood, yeah. So that's a problem if we think this is going to tell us everything we need. Maya, and then...
I think it's the system, what Nino said is, like, I agree with the thing that he's so defensive about that instability that he is just overcompensating and saying, wait, no, we do have a definite answer.
Yeah.
But the answer that he's proposing, I think, is extremely ideological.
Okay.
And it's kind of, it's perpetuating that kind of categorization that came up with modernism.
Yeah.
Right? And it's kind of mystification.
Very nicely said. Exactly. Myth is not fully, doesn't, well, one reason why it's mystification is because it's telling you this is how it's always been and this is how it always will be.
Exactly.
So if you don't think your value as like a female figure is validated in this myth, well, I'm sorry, that's myth. Exactly. So wait, that's not what we're here for. We're not here to reproduce myth, is it? Do we walk in this classroom and reproduce previous myths to future students? Myth transfer? That's what we do? No way. I don't identify with that.
No, I absolutely don't think so. And it's like saying that, okay, in nature, we do see that it's cyclical.
Yeah.
You go from spring to winter and summer and everything. You've got that cycle. But it isn't that way in stories. That's basically how the canon is formed.
Yeah.
Right? That's the point of it being canonical.
Yeah.
It's not as if you're finding you're realizing that, oh look, this same pattern is everywhere, but it's more that it's being perpetuated by this ideology that's telling us that this is what the dominant.
This is the pattern to know. Yeah, exactly. Maybe Christianity or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And well, obviously, so to add, there's issues of patriarchy, there's issues of racial hierarchy, all these myths. Yeah. So if that's what we're reconfirming over and over again, that sounds pretty dismal, especially if we think it doesn't validate us. Second, though, is just that I'll just point out is that there's actually a little ego thinking here. Of the 50s and 60s, he's not really fully aware of the ecological impact of seasonal change or anything like that, but at least I'll give him a tiny bit of credit of saying, like, actually there's a potential eco thought, and it's interesting that one of the first real eco-theorists in the 1970s was a big Fry person and thought comedy and green, and that really should teach us something about the pastoral, and of course now pastoral studies is much more interesting and bigger by varying it, but he actually, I will say that I'm tempted to, like, I will never root literary study in nature as such, or in seasons as such. But I do like to talk about them. I do like to theorize and think, and in classrooms and say, well, there's something seasonal about what's going on. What's the time and place? What's the landscape? What's the weather like in this text? Because that actually is meaningful to me. And I can use some of my Fry tools to talk about that. I wouldn't call them microtypes, but I would definitely want to talk about them as real places with weather and so on. Okay, Sarah, and then was it Kelly? Did you have
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say, I think it is interesting that like it's got that reference to the Golden Bough to Fraser like, in the notes.
Yeah.
And he mentions some, I think. Because like Fraser's Golden Bough as like is also a universalistic text, right?
Yeah.
It's like a text of like early religious anthropology that's like, here are the myths that everyone has.
Exactly.
They're all the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
he loves that.
Anthropologists are like, that's not true.
Exactly.
We're all
Yeah.
against
It's bad anthropology. Yeah. Just at the moment that everyone's saying that's bad anthropology, he's like, oh, this is good literary criticism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to kind of have that comparison, and obviously it also like is really reminiscent of like Joseph Campbell and the monomyth. Like it's the same kind of drive, I think. And I thought it was really interesting in like the little introduction where they're talking about Fry, where they say like there may be, of course this is not like a full and complete study of all of like the stories of the world, but Fry would argue that because these things are true and universal, all those stories would fit into it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
eventually we'll have time to systematize and
which is
like,
all
literature.
Exactly the point is like you're doing this. Well, you're just saying that, but without actually looking at those stories from other places, from other areas, like drawing in other influences, you are not opening yourself up to the possibility that there are stories that are different and don't fit your model.
Exactly.
Right? And it's the same problem that Fraser has. It's the same problem that Campbell has. Is like, these are somewhat useful frameworks for analyzing certain pieces of art in certain cultural contexts that they really want to be universal because they're universal in the things that they particularly have read, but they've also read really narrowly.
Yeah. I won't totally throw out the window that there are maybe some universals or let's say some recurring patterns in literary study. And I do talk about genres and I do talk about tragedies, analogies, and so on. I don't obsess over them, but I think they are helpful, especially maybe on the first day. So so Fry is not totally off the mark on saying how do we start. Why not? But I certainly wouldn't say that's my destination in terms of progress. Like that, I want to I just want to map these myths and find them over and over again. Kelly, go ahead.
Well, like in listening to the debates and everyone poking holes into a system, I kind of wonder if this piece is performative in the way that like, how do we define literature? Let's define it. Oh, it's actually impossible. So he's kind of like showing, like in like trying to define literature, he's showing you can't actually do it.
Maybe, yeah, he's running into that. Well, he's also kind of conceded the fact that maybe, reading like ancient religious texts is just as valuable. You're going to find the same archetypes. So what's so special about literature now? He's almost thrown literature under the bus in a way or performing this inability to define it in a way through his own arguments. The exact opposite of what he wanted it to do. He wanted, in fact, very much ground it. Okay, well, the last thing I'll just point out is that you'll notice in this map there are really no close readings. That's a theme for next week, the close reader, the invention of close reading. Fry's just as happy mapping as he is close reading. Here he doesn't need to do any readings. It's all just, you fit it all into a giant map that actually has very little textual discussion. It's not to say he doesn't do close reading, he does. He's very brilliant. He's got a book on William Blake. That was his really first major thing, and there's plenty of close reading in there, but as even the little blurb footnote, or head note, we call it, to the thing points out that like actually Fry is more interesting when he's dropping the whole archetype stuff, and when he's just reading Blake, or doing some close reading of Shakespeare. Like he's got a lot of interesting things to say in a great literary professor way. So, but then you're back into the casual, or you're back into the one-off, and you've lost your system. So that problem never goes away, does it? Okay, we only have like 10 minutes and we have one last reading. It's kind of impossible to do that, but I don't know. Let's just at least point out a few things from this Lauren Berlant. And once again, we're in the world of crisis. However, this happens to be the contemporary crisis. So this is an essay from 2018. Sadly, Lauren Berlant passed away fairly young, 2 years ago. Was one of the most visible literary theorists of her generation. I've seen her many times, and definitely will be missed. This is a short essay. I don't think we have to spend a huge amount of time on it. I might go super fast through it, given that we have 10 minutes. Basically, she's saying, once again, we're in this position where she says, okay, she works for the journal Critical Inquiry, very well-known journal, still one of the great ones, and publishes a lot of literary criticism, as she says on the first page, but sometimes there's like two critical strategies she identifies in this next sentence. Sometimes the theorist wants to open up the object, and sometimes the theorist wants to close the object. Sometimes you want to extend a question, or sometimes you want to put it to rest. So sometimes you want to like say, I'm not really sure what I think is the overall take I have, like, or what's this literature doing, but I certainly want to open it up to those questions. Here are some set of questions. Here's how we might start to approach that question. That would be one way of doing literary criticism. Second one would be, you know what, actually, we've been reading this way, and that's useful to a point, but I actually think we should read it this way. So I'm going to close that and kind of lay the ground for this thing. She says, in fact, we're almost always mixed. Control the object enough to say a thing about it, but also change it enough that it comes to organizing surprising kinds of exemplary association. So very eloquently, Laurent Berlin has just kind of mapped out, he's like, maybe this is actually what we're really doing. We want a little bit of system to sort of stabilize or control our object, but we also want a little bit of surprise, and sort of discovery and opening. But then she says, okay, sometimes that ambivalence that is in the object or in the literature or in our methods actually becomes bigger when circumstances alter it before our eyes, whether it's the value of literary criticism itself, the pedagogy, identity triggers, public education, the failure of the political world to be worthy of our attachment to it. Under those circumstances, when one's defenses are made manifestly insecure by an uncontrollable disturbance in the object's stability, we do what I'm calling genre flailing. Genre flailing is a mode of crisis management that arises after an object or object world becomes disturbed in a way that intrudes on one's confidence about how to move in it. We genre flail so that we don't fall through cracks of heightened affective noise into despair, suicide, or psychosis. We improvise like crazy, where like crazy is a little too non-metaphorical. We see it in the first gasps of shock or disbelief and the last gasps of exhausted analogy, but it's not always wildly inventive action. When crisis is ordinary, flailing, throwing language and gesture and policy and interpretations at a thing to make it slow or make it stop, or just make it make sense, can be fabulously unimaginative too. A litany of lists of things to do, pay attention to say, to stop saying, or to discipline and sanction. Okay, I just want to actually, well, I will ask a question, which is, what does she mean by genre flailing? We just saw the master of the systematizing of genres, Northrop Frye. Laurent Berlin is pointing out something very different about genre. What is genre flailing? You may want to take that on. Go for it.
I'm not sure, but I feel like what she's trying to say is that, so you criticize an object, and an artistic object, but then this object is nebulous, it changes, and that moment that it changes, that it doesn't fit your criticism anymore, you start changing your criticism and having that final comment that would fit the change that has occurred.
That could be a good, and I think that's a great example of potential genre flailing. There's maybe a little one step further that she goes in this argument about what genre flailing is like. So it's not even a particular art object, or like even, let's say, it's like modernism studies or something like that you have thought you had a sort of method into, is what might also provoke, let's say, next step of genre flailing.
Trenches even just like social and political events.
And why? Why are they calling it genre?
Because they're just destabilizing. Like, they make you feel insecure, and like you have to be able to provide a comment on it.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. So basically, when the world changes socially, politically, I would add, existentially, even cosmologically, whatever you want. You're in your Nietzsche, she's in her Nietzsche, or whatever. Anyway, like when you're questioning everything, or when the world's questioning you. And this was written in the first iteration of the Trump era, when it was like, what do we do now? And are we all going to disappear? And is Trump going to destroy us? And is fascism going to take over? Maybe that's where you are you are thrown into a moment of genre flailing in which you become a little over defensive, and you want to, but you're also recognizing that the crisis won't go away. And you're looking for crisis management. She calls genre flailing as a mode of crisis management. And you're trying to stabilize that object or make sense of it, but still everything is sort of becoming thrown into question.
I'm just curious, it sounds like the way that she's like figuring is that genre flailing is the thing that I guess the person looking at the object does.
Yeah.
But it also, like when I was reading it the first time that I like read the word, I assumed that where she was going was that the object genre flails, like the object exceeds bounds, or like it
could be that too.
Is it like both?
It could be both. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's sort of where like instead of like appreciating, let's say, the ambivalence or ambiguity that we might say, we like actually like not totally identical genres, maybe mixed genres or whatever. That would be more. We're not flailing at that moment. We're really flailing when we're not really sure what's going on with this text, or is it even worth reading anymore? That would be a genre for that moment.
So is it kind of like almost the opposite of like negative capability?
Well, it is connected to negative capability because actually it would like we don't know exactly what we're doing with this genre. That's a form of negative capability.
Okay.
We might be over defensive though and respond like I really believe the value of literature or value of this text.
Yeah.
Like no one's going to genre flare around Shakespeare. No one's going to genre flare around Ulysses. But we don't all just do that as a career. And even if we did, I still don't think actually that solves the problem of what is literary criticism. Just because you've got some major canonical stuff. And also how many people need to over and over again write on that stuff. These are questions. And but bigger picture is sort of like, what if we don't believe in literature anymore? What if we don't know what we believe in anymore? What if we're not sure why we're here? What if we're not sure what English department is for anymore? And what if we're not sure how I should read anymore? Because I'm in a moment of fascism. Does reading matter? Sorry if I use the F word. Does reading fucking matter when there's fascism and violence and war outside? You're wasting your damn time, stupid English majors. Okay? The world's falling apart. Okay? And it's burning up. And machines are going to take over. AI is just going to do your fucking reading for you. Okay? End of the day, the F word always comes up. That's when the world has changed and forced you in that genre crisis, genre flailing, if you will. And you don't know what you're doing anymore and what the value of anything is. And you wonder what we should do anymore. And then she goes on to diagnose a little bit more. She's like, typically your defense mechanism is humorlessness. No, I believe what we do. We are serious folks in the English department. We believe in what we do. We're not screwing around. Okay, we can laugh and joke, but we really believe in what we do. And we should not certainly we're not self-satirical. That would be silly in the face of all this terrible stuff. But also, that we should double down on theory. We should double down on the seriousness of what we do. Double down on that Lacan. Double down on that, or double down on whatever personal theories we like best. Historicism, you name it, because we will stop genre flailing as long as we just get serious about our methods. That's always the anecdote. The anecdote. Not anecdote. But her point again is that it's probably not really going to make flailing go away. It's not going to solve the world's crises per se. And also that humorlessness might actually tell us something important. Maybe so on the one hand, maybe we actually will learn stuff about that. Humorlessness is a weird word. Sometimes we might call it something like reparative reading, maybe a phrase you've heard before from this person called Itzev Zhuik, who we will read in a couple weeks. But those people are pretty serious. Like actually we do, just check the time here, but I consider what we do, care work to some degree, redemptive, if that's another word. Like I want us to be caring people, careful readers, thinking carefully about texts. Like that sounds right to me. That's a little, but it's on the serious side of things of what we do. By the way, Nietzsche and there's some queer theorists, like someone who I like, Leo Bersani, would say, no, we want to shatter ourselves. We want to break our habits and expectations and really just push ourselves in that way. So you could see how there are many opposite ways that we might go around. And even that, though, is a form of care work, actually. He's a queer theorist, and that would be, in some sense, to open us truly to a kind of queer newness. And I'm not going to go paragraph by paragraph here, but basically, Laura Bland thinks that, okay, on the one hand, our defense mechanisms about what we do and double downing on it might, there's nothing wrong with that, although it risks maybe being a little too, let's say, humorless or throwing away maybe ambivalence or ambiguity, or also this sort of psychological thing that we're in, which is crisis. But other approaches that we'll see, especially at the end of the class, like more like doubling down on just the aesthetic pleasure of literature, and the identification with it, that you should identify with the characters or the author, and applaud the literature for achieving that form of happy identification. Find the literature that you identify with, pick it, study it, job done. I like the 1970s feminist texts in the United States. That's the one I identify with. That's my field. Okay, but then the genre flailing thing didn't go away. You just sort of picked a spot to sort of claim. Anyways, she wonders what we do in that situation. She doesn't have all the answers. By the end of it, she says the following, 161. I'll read a little bit, two things. Well, I'll read around on 161 from the very top. It says, we can ask ourselves, where is the humorless in my work? What am I protecting from exposure to change? Rather than assuming the unity of an intentionally empathetic, careful, playful tone is evidence of anything unmixed in its reparativity, we need to seek the work of style and tone as both hard-shell charismatic defenses and affective openings that make the way for concepts to emerge. She says, conclusion. Another way to see this is people still want to read things. Reading with is an ethics of collaborative critical engagement. She goes on to give some examples. But anyways, people want, she says a little further on, people want to, they have a hunger to write sentences. They want to make something different by reading with it. Co-being, she calls it. Connecting with literature, that's a good thing too. Finally, the last paragraph. The violence of the world makes us flail about for things to read with, people to talk to, material for inducing transformation. It could make it possible not to aspire to feel at war or to be right, but to be disturbed together, thrashing with and creating value through a shift in the object. The value of recognizing the aggression and desire is that people who desire to be good won't inadvertently secure it through a disavowal of humorlessness. There's a complicated psychoanalysis there, but anyways. Finally, our critical ambivalence towards opening our objects to a transformation whose effects are not foreclosed might make us better at holding the objects that are also changing. So just that last sentence, a little bit of holding, a little bit of changing, those are probably going to be good for us. A little bit of, we might say, system and method, a little bit of surprise and discovery. Those might be together what we actually do. It's a beautiful, articulated essay. It's short, and I didn't give it justice, but that's all I could do for now. I'm sure we'll come back to some genre flailing as we go forward. So anyways, I'm super excited that we just did this first day, and we will do a lot more of this as we go forward. Looking forward to it. Oh, and then the sign up. Did you sign up?
I skipped me.
Okay, well, we'll talk in a second, but is everyone okay with what they signed up with? Nobody signed up for next week. That's perfectly fine. So that's what we're going to double check, but that's totally good. We'll have some good space to talk. Do you want to? How do you feel?
Probably not.
No? It's up to you. I would actually encourage, but it's up to you.
Let me think about it.
Think about it, yeah. It's not a requirement, but if you want.
Yeah, that's what I wanted.
When you see a few of them, maybe you'll
Yeah.
see how people do it.
Yeah, I don't know.
But you're welcome to talk anytime.
Right, okay.
Tell me what your thoughts are. If we're
I don't think
making
I had
some
that
sense in the way.
Or maybe I wasn't paying attention.
I remember that so we brought it back.
Oh, true, yeah, because you're at Western too, so maybe if you want to.
That's like the only thing I remember the first year.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay, Jen.
I'm so tired too. You had a long day, right?
Especially first weeks. I always say like sometimes it's scary. Once I get it, October is already like done.
I know, it goes fast. Yeah.
But it's okay. I'm glad we've gotten so far. Week 2. Week 1 for us.
Yeah.
So here you are in the MA.
Yeah, so I need to wake up a little bit. Yeah, so basically I have to submit already the prospectus for my independent research proposal, next week. So I was going to do trans theory, and I need to learn more about it, but we switched, so Professor Keep is my supervisor. And now I think we're like switching more to like sexuality because I'm really obsessed with Venus and Furs.
Okay.
And what I liked initially about it was like the gender representation of the main character, right? Because his masculinity is so different, and his expression of sexuality. So now I guess I'm swapping that to sexuality. So I've just been talking to professors. Like I talked to Professor Para today, and he was talking about this book he recommended that is showing sexuality is like gender and. What is it? Gender is like an outcropping of sex. Oh yeah, sexuality and gender is as like manifestations of sex. Like, so maybe go for that.
What do you even mean by sex? Because that's even a debated term in sexual studies and in literary theory.
Yeah. But so I guess look at that debate more and then do Foucault on
history of sexuality.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in like Psychopathia Sexualis and like the like kind of like the real world qualitative like stories of people's like experiences with sexuality, especially non-normative sexuality. So I don't know, dude.
Yeah, they're all excellent project topics and things. I mean, it's good that you have a text that's the basis, which is.
But I have to. It's German though, and I can't. I know. So that's problematic
but
too.
It's filtered through translations and effects on English literature, and so you could trace some of that if you're interested too.
And at least Deleuze did the translation, so it's pretty good.
Deleuze, of course, yeah. There's plenty of talk, on these very topics. In Trans Studies, a book that came out just a few months ago, I think it's going to be really. I only just leafed through. Is by Grace Lavery.
Okay, let me write that
down. I don't even know the title. I can't remember.
Okay.
Grace Lavery's.
How do you spell their last name? Kind of.
Lavery.
Okay.
And the book is called. Maybe it's just pleasure and efficacy.
Okay.
There's sort of like trans methodology.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very literary as well.
Okay.
And I don't know what text she's looking at too much. If Venus and Furs even appears there, but it might. I have a good old friend who works a lot on some of these topics. His name is Benjamin Kahan.
Okay.
Kahan. He has a book called. The title is called The Book of Minor Perverts.
Okay.
Somewhat awkward title.
No, it's great.
From Foucault.
Sure.
From the history of sexuality. And it's about modernist, mostly I think American literature, and issues of non-normative sexuality as a literary phenomenon.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Yeah. So super smart book. So take a look at that one.
Okay.
We obviously have a bit of material on that when we're doing queer theory in this class, so that'll help give you some anchor.
Yeah, so I'm not even doing trans theory anymore, I guess, because you can't argue the character is like trans, though I'm learning too about queer theory, like you can apply it to non-queer. It's like a lens, right? So you don't need a queer character or a trans queer character to transit, right?
I've heard Grace Lavery talk a few times and would not, I think, be that strict on what constitutes a
Yeah.
I think so Lavery's work is more about trying to it's obviously not just gender unstable or ambivalent character is probably not per se trans, but Grace Lavery's works is very interested about why we are marking this in the way we do. So very smart about that very problem.
Okay.
And probably is a little bit more open. I know that Halberstam is also more open.
Okay.
Tends to be more open. Is like, Halberstam was like, I consider myself trans, but except for I didn't grow up with that word, so I don't know if I consider myself trans. What Halberstam would say. So maybe I shouldn't use that word. It's like, wrote a book on it, nonetheless. So it's like, there's, so Halberstam's work is obviously relevant, and the book called Trans, which we're and it's a lot about what is in the name, anyways.
Oh, okay.
That first chapter is the one that we're reading.
Okay.
So, I think all of those will help you. You don't have to have all the answers in your IRB week 2.
Yeah.
But if you point out some of this stuff, that's enough, and then you'll develop it throughout the year.
It's just hard because I feel like everything I say gets like shot down by Professor Keeps, and I'm like going to all these professors just like asking the questions like what is viable, because it feels like everything. He's like, it's too 80s, it's too 90s. Like, I'm just
Well,
kind of
this stuff is
lost
very
here.
contemporary.
I'm trying. I'm trying to be contemporary. Yeah.
Lavery, Halberstam, Kahan. That'll get you very far. And who else is my favorite? Well, Lavery's bibliography is super up to date. It just came out.
And that's like sexual and trans.
Yeah.
Do you think good intersection
Queer theory,
there?
yeah.
Okay,
Lavery started in
okay.
queer theory and sort of tried to say, okay, what's the slight difference between trans and queer?
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Is articulating it in that text.
And you think I can still hold on to Venus and Furs? Like
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
really
think it's
want
Venus,
to. Okay. And then, is it really bad form to use like real life stories like Psychopathia Sexualis? Like, how bad form is that in English?
Okay, Kahan's work is all about that.
Okay,
He
yeah.
studies that stuff and understands why. Actually, Kraft Ebing was interested in literature. He calls it the revolving door between sexology and literature.
That's
But
cool.
So he's studying literature, and literature's reading him.
Yeah.
And he's a famous example, and I will forget, but there's like a book written like in the 1920s in the United States, in New York City. It's basically we might call it one of the first trans novels. There's actually probably earlier novels too, but I think that person might have read Venus and Furs. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know when that book starts circulating and when's it translated.
And you don't know what it's called? Do you remember?
It'll be in his book. I can email him right now, but you'll just get his book. Book of Minor Perverts, and you'll see. I mean, I can look.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Once I see the chapter layout. I don't know. It doesn't name it.
Okay.
You'll have to look it up. Okay, you'll have to look it up.
No, that's okay.
It'll be good. Okay, can we leave it? Is that okay for now?
Yeah, it's like, feels like too broad and too narrow. I don't know. Do you have any advice about just how to write this, like, proposal so it makes some sense, but there's still, like, a lot of possibilities? Because I'm kind of gender flailing. Like, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, use that. Use Berlant.
Yeah, you could. Just go meta.
Berlant is a famous queer lyricist, and you can absolutely use that essay. So,
okay.
Talk about that and say, is this a model of trans scholarship and study? Can we use some of these arguments for this particular text? And maybe one other English language text, that novel that responds to this. Something like that. That's a good enough.